Hello, my name is Yemi Bamiro, and I'm the director of One Man and His Shoes.
Hi, I'm Will Thorne, and I'm the producer of One Man.
That is the trailer for the recently released documentary, One Man and His Shoes. And this is Factual America. Factual America is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for an international audience. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and every week we look at America through the lens of documentary filmmaking by interviewing filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, to find out where you can see our films, and to connect with our team. Michael Jordan is largely considered the greatest basketball player of all time, but he could also be considered America's first black cultural icon, blazing a trail for other African American athletes like LeBron James. Besides his performance on the court, Jordan rocketed to fame on the back of a clever and innovative marketing campaign to sell sneakers, and a shrewd business model that made him a billionaire. However, has success come with a price? While Nike and Jordan have made billions of dollars, they have also created a shoe culture that sees some misguided youths literally killing each other to get their hands on the latest pair of Air Jordans. Yemi Bamiro and Will Thorne capture all of this in their recently released documentary, One Man and His Shoes. We recently caught up with Yemi and Will from their homes in London and Berlin. Yemi Bamiro and Will Thorne, welcome to Factual America. Yemi, how are things? Are you in London?
Yeah. Well, I'm just outside London. I'm sort of near Kingston, a little place called Surbiton.
I know Surbiton. I've been there.
Yeah, quite leafy. Yeah. I live in Surbiton. Yeah, so not far from London. Sort of like zone 5 or 6 or something.
This is something that anyone not from London's not going to understand, but that's
okay.
but having lived there many years, there is a big difference.
Yeah.
And Will, are you in Berlin of all places?
Yeah, I'm in Berlin. It's actually a bit later here than London, which is why it's so dark.
And for every transparency's sake, no pun intended, we've made Will switch rooms because of sound issues. So
Berlin, so it's the techno nightclub vibe. Yeah.
Well, it is kind of a Berlin scene, I think. But you guys keeping safe where you're at?
Yeah, we're all good. Yeah, I've got a 3-year-old, so I'm kind of got my hands full day to day with her. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, hey, it's thanks for coming on to the podcast. Again, as listeners have heard the trailer, we're talking about the film One Man and His Shoes. I want to again thanks for coming onto the podcast. It's the first episode of season 2, and I want to welcome back our listeners we've got a great lineup for this year, but we've got a bit of unfinished business because we've been wanting to get you guys on for a while now. We were supposed to meet up in March in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest, and that didn't happen, as we all know. It's been a crazy year. So maybe you can give us a little update. Yemi, is the film premiered yet?
Technically, yes.
Yeah.
But it depends on what territory you're referring to. I think that, we managed to sort of get a sale with the film. So we sold the TV rights to Vice TV. So it's gone out in America, and there's going to be a digital release of the film in August. And the film will be playing in Australia and New Zealand, I think, this week. So yeah, it depends on which territory. I think the European sort of premiere is going to be at the end of August. So I think technically it has sort of premiered.
So for our listeners out there, we've Yemi's just unveiled for you that we've actually, yes, we are recording this in early August. We are releasing it in early September. But so it will be, so by early September, anyone listening to this podcast should be able to access the film. Would that be fair enough to say?
Yeah, that would be fair.
Okay. Well, it's great stuff. I highly recommend it. I thanks for the for me. I got being based here in the UK. I got a sneak peek and really enjoyed it. So thanks for that link. Yemi, so for most of our listeners, they probably haven't seen it yet. Maybe you can give us a synopsis. I know they've had the trailer. They've pretty well aware it's about Michael Jordan and related matters. But why don't you give us a little synopsis of what this about the film?
The film One Man in His Shoes is about the phenomenon of Air Jordan sneakers, sort of told by the men and women that were responsible for creating the phenomenon. I think for a long time when I was thinking about this film, I was obsessed with how it happened and, you know, who was responsible for making it happen, you know, because these sneakers sort of, you know, they penetrated pop culture and they sort of like changed the landscape of everything when it comes to sort of like athlete and brand endorsement deals. So I, for a long time, was obsessed with, you know, how that happened, the sort of, you know, the who was responsible in that, and you know, all the surrounding sort of like elements that went into sort of like Nike, you know, signing Michael Jordan to this really lucrative, you know, endorsement deal at a time when athletes weren't really getting endorsement deals like that. So the film sort of like details, you know, the cultural phenomenon, the sort of like the racial significance of this of the sneaker, and sort of, you know, how African Americans, you know, like sort of change that brand into something that you know is something that we all know today. And then it's also about sort of like the darker side of, you know, consumerism, and sort of like it explores this idea of, you know, young kids in inner cities across the states, you know, have been getting killed or, you know, like murdering other kids for these sneakers. And I was just kind of, you know, really intrigued as to sort of like why that story hadn't really been told before. You know, there's been lots of stories on like sneakerheads and sort of like sneaker culture, but nothing specifically about this shoe. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Okay. I mean, if we can maybe give our listeners a little bit of background. I mean, we're talking obviously about the U.S. We're talking about 1980s America. We'll even go back and film actually looks at the 70s as well. But what were things like before Michael Jordan?
In terms of like sneaker endorsement deals, they didn't really exist. Like the NBA had, you know, the sneaker of the NBA was Converse.
Yeah.
So Converse pretty much had that market like wrapped up, and they weren't that adventurous when it came to marketing. The shoes weren't great. They was just sort of like, you know, shoes that all the NBA players sort of wore. And, you know, I think Nike were a running company. They were sort of like renowned for sort of like making running shoes. And it sort of came at a time when their business wasn't doing too well and they wanted to sort of, you know, branch into basketball. So they, you know, they hired a scout, a guy called Sonny Vaccaro, who sort of had his ear to the ground in terms of sort of like, you know, who were the young sort of like up and coming like college kids that, you know, were going to make it to the league. And this was all sort of like spearheaded by a guy called Rob Strasser, who was sort of like tasked with sort of like essentially saving the business of, as far as Nike goes. You know, they were getting sort of like trumped by sort of like Adidas at that time, and sort of like Reebok were doing really good in America, and Nike sort of like lost their way a little bit. So Rob Strasser was sort of like tasked with, you know, getting Nike into basketball. And yeah, like Michael Jordan was the guy that they sort of wanted to roll the dice on. And before that time, that, you know, this didn't exist. I think Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, perhaps, who was like signed to Adidas, you know, he had a pretty lucrative sort of deal at the time, but I think it was annually about $100,000.
I think that brings us to a good point to watch a clip from or listen to a clip from the film, and it talks specifically exactly about this, which is the sort of the pre-Jordan era of shoe contracts, including a Converse ad that is in retrospect is so cheesy, but yet there's nothing ironic about it. I mean, and I'm of an age and grew up there. I remember this stuff, and it's quite in retrospect, it's a bit cringing, but yeah, that's what it was. That's life in '80s America. So let's listen, or if you're on YouTube, watch that clip. Well, for yours truly, that's a walk down memory lane. But I love the Clyde Frazier bit. But you mentioned before, Yemi, about Sonny Vaccaro, who's well, he's a big name on many different ways in U.S. basketball. But Will, I think you have a story about Sonny.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, you know, Sonny was always in Yemi's thinking, like, you know, this is someone we have to get for the story. You know, it's like a lot of the film kind of hangs on, you know, his participation in the whole story of Jordan, really. But yeah, he wasn't the easiest guy to get hold of, and I think, I don't know, Yem, you'll have to jump in, but maybe like 2 years we were trying to chase him down, trying to get him on camera.
Yeah, it took about 2 years to get Sonny, and yeah, I'd say about 18 months, 2 years. And I think it's funny because the first time I ever contacted him, he was like, yeah, that's fine, like you can come. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, you could just come to my house and we can do this. And I was like, that's way too easy. And then I think like a few days later, he was just kind of like, oh, he had a family issue. And he's like, we're kind of like sort this out at another time. And I was like heartbroken at that. And then I think after that, it was like literally me trying every 6 months to sort of, you know, check in on him and see if he'd sort of, you know, if he'd be willing to sort of go on camera. Because I don't think he had his own documentary. ESPN did a 30 for 30 on him called Soul Man.
Right.
And, you know, he had that, but I don't think he'd never been in any sort of like documentary where he was a contributor, where it wasn't solely about him. And obviously I'm just some random guy from Southeast London that sort of like calls him up and it's just like, do you want to be in this documentary? Like, we're making it independently. We've got no backing. I just kind of like, you know, but I think it was important to sort of get, you know, the surrounding cast on board. Like we had Peter Moore pretty, you know, on board pretty early, and they still talk, you know, and we got Julie Strasser, who's sort of like Rob Strasser's ex-wife, widow, you know, so we got, and then we got Jim Riswold, and these were sort of like key sort of like architects of this whole thing. Jim Riswold was obviously sort of like the Wyden and Kennedy executive that was, you know, responsible for sort of like the Spike and Mike ads. Yeah. So I just kind of thought that, well, if we can get all of these like amazing sort of, you know, these were sort of like essentially his teammates when it came to sort of like building this thing, then I kind of thought that we would stand a good chance of sort of like getting him. But I think the person that helped me out was Roland Lazenby, who's Michael Jordan's biographer. Yep. You know, his book is sort of like, it's like the Bible on Michael Jordan. Like, it's called The Life, and it's like the most definitive book that you'll ever read on Jordan. And, you know, he obviously interviewed Sonny a number of times for that book. And I interviewed Roland quite early on in the process. I think in 2014, I interviewed him. And he was just like so gracious and lovely. And, you know, he was like, you know, I'll help connect you. And, you know, he helped me out massively in sort of like, you know, getting to Sonny. And I think I think a lot of the time it's about trust, you know, like, and just sort of like knowing that, you know, not everybody you ask is going to be in your documentary, but you've sort of got to show a little bit of perseverance and sort of just know that, you know, there could be a slight chance that they might come round. And I think, like I said, we had sort of like some of his key sort of like, you know, colleagues, if you will, who were also, you know, responsible for creating this thing at that time. So yeah, in short, it took about 2 years, but you know, it was completely worth it because, you know, him and his wife are just, they've been such huge supporters of this film. And yeah, they're truly lovely people.
Well, and I think it's, I mean, again, it's actually a question I was going to have later when we talk to you more about the project, but I think this is appropriate time. I mean, you've talked about these people you've lined up. I mean, it's quite incredible. You've got David Stern. I mean, unfortunately he's passed on, but you got him on camera. You've got the one that struck me too is especially another architect of this, whatever we want to call this, the thing that became Michael Jordan, the cultural icon, is David Falk. And all these people were willing, they were perfectly happy to go on camera and go on the record about all this, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think David Stern still sort of blows my mind that we managed to sort of like get him. Because and he was like really lovely. Like the only request that they had is that we do it in New York, and we sort of like do it near his office. But he was like, you know, really gracious and really interesting and so nice. And he's David Stern, you know, like it was insane that he was sort of like even giving us the time of day, but there were no airs and graces. And it's the same with David Falk. And I think these guys are sort of, you know, if we're calling them architects, this is their legacy. And I think, you know, we've all got egos, and I think whenever anybody sort of like, you know, can you talk about your legacy? Of course I'll talk about, you know, this thing that I helped create, because it's, you know, I'm proud of it. And I think there was a little bit of that involved, but you know, there was no ego with any of these guys. I think they were just really proud, and you know, they had stuff to say that was interesting, and they believed in the project.
Yeah. I think this is, we've got a second clip that we're going to show that's not occurs in the film pretty soon after the first one we've just seen, where but it features David Falk certainly talking about what sort of the roots of making Michael Jordan basically a marketing icon. So let's listen and or watch that clip now. All right, so we've just heard David Falk said the best thing. What was is Michael Jordan says it's the best and only good decision thing he did was on the marketing side. But sort of the rest is history. So Michael Jordan's a cultural icon. He becomes the greatest of all time. Air Jordans pulling billions of dollars each year. I think the African American community sort of latches on to Air Jordans as a success story, as one of their brands. People are saying Jordan's a trailblazer in terms of marketing, what he's done, blazing a trail for other African American athletes. So, but you know, I thought it was an interesting point that we're not trying to give away too much of the film, but this role that Spike Lee played in all this, and maybe this wouldn't have even happened without Spike Lee. What do you think about that, Yemi?
I think that I think Spike Lee is the genius of sort of like Nike in terms of, you know, being like incredible at marketing. You know, they understood that there's no worth in having this like incredible product if, you know, you're not going to market it in a way that's going to appeal to young people. And, you know, they were doing that in the late 70s and early 80s. And I think, you know, they just were really good at connecting the dots. You know, they took this sort of like young African-American sort of like indie filmmaker and, you know, whose like first film had sort of like resonated in New York. And then they thought, well, you know, how about we pair him with, you know, this sort of like rookie and who's got this shoe. And you know, it was a match made in heaven. I think those two things are just synonymous, you know, like, and I think those adverts are just genius. I think Jim Riswold talked a lot about how, you know, groundbreaking those sort of those ads and those commercials were. And I don't think we've really seen anything like that since. I think everything has been sort of like an imitation of that in the kindest way, you know, but I think they were so groundbreaking. They were so funny. They had humor. You know, like MJ didn't even speak a lot in those commercials. It was kind of like Spike just doing all of it. And you know, that they were shot in black and white, and, you know, nothing had been marketed like that before. Like, you know, we spoke earlier about the Converse ad. It was just, you know, just so on the head. It was so kind of like sterile and sort of like a bit clinical. But I think these ads had humor, and that was, you know, that was because of Spike and, you know, Jim Riswold, and then also just, you know, how courageous and sort of like adventurous Nike were with just sort of like just taking a risk and just, you know, thinking to themselves, what the hell, like what's the worst can go wrong? We kind of like know that the benchmark is here when it comes to sort of like sneaker sort of like commercials. So, you know, we can do a little bit better. So,
I mean, as someone who lived through that era, and you've done an amazing job capturing sort of the zeitgeist of 1980s and 90s America. I mean, maybe Will has something to say on this. I don't know. But you guys, you use a lot of archival. I mean, in a great way. I think you use it very well. I mean, that's not cheap stuff to use, I imagine. How did you have any struggles with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of credit card bills. About the archive, but just a quick thing on Spike Lee. The thing I find interesting about Spike Lee and the kind of Jordan phenomenon is, I think that's one of the first things for me really was do the right thing. You know, I just remember it so clearly, you know, back in the 80s and when you first saw that film, and it was, you know, I think that was, you know, just sort of crystallized even for me as like however old I was, like, you know, sort of a young teenager or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And it was actually, I went back and saw a lot of the Nike adverts, you know, kind of way after they'd even sort of been out. And you know, it just showed how Spike kind of continued to sort of be in line with the brand and sort of helping push it and helping it to sort of be in, you know, the cultural conversation, I suppose, you know, my Jordans, all of that. You know, for me, that was kind of one of my entry points into, you know, this Jordan phenomenon from a personal point of view. So, you know, when we kind of go off and make this film is because like it's coming from a place of like, wow, this brand, we love it as well. And yeah, for me, that was kind of, I knew about Jordans before that film, but I suppose that's the kind of concrete memory. That's where I got on board, and you know, that's where you kind of go, all right, I'm sold.
Exactly.
Which is what happens to a lot of people. But yeah, there's a lot of archive in the film, which, you know, posed challenges, you know, right from the start. I mean, I could talk for hours about the challenges on this film, but we always knew. Well, Yemi was always quite clear from the start. Look, you know, it's going to have a bunch of archive because we're telling, you know, a story from, you know, decades ago, but also, you know, the kind of animated style, the way that it was all going to get brought together. That was always in the thinking right from the start. So we kind of knew we had a crutch of how to kind of make it pacey, make it entertaining, you know, whip it along. So it's not just like you know, eating your greens on a history story, but I mean, as you mentioned, some of it even goes back to the 70s. And I mean, this is a kind of decade spanning documentary, which I think, you know, Yemi and Michael did a great job with not just kind of what you think is traditional archive, but, you know, kind of everything, bringing it up into the present day, you know.
You made a good point there about even the little bit of animation with some of the stills and some of the archive. I thought that was, you know, well done. I mean, the intro's amazing, I think.
Well, you know, a little shout out to Will Newell, who is our graphics and animator. Yeah. I mean, he's, you know, like one of the main sort of team members, if you like. And, you know, he sort of has added his gold dust, as we call it, all over the film. And, and it helps bring stills alive. As you say, archive's super expensive. Excuse me. One way around that is to use stills and just put the still on the screen a bit longer, do something with it, you know? So that's kind of, you know, page one of using archive. Luckily, you know, Will was our kind of secret weapon to bring that stuff alive, and in the style of, like you say, the 80s, the 90s, it's all kind of in there. It's all in the DNA.
Well, in the music too, but yeah, but back to even the like you said, the graphics and design. I mean, I think it's not something yet. I hadn't even noticed, a lack of archive video. Certainly there, but I think it's got a nice fast pace to it. I think it's and it's in keeping with the subject matter. Certainly up through that first certainly that hour, but that's kind of presaging a bit of another question I'm going to ask you. I think, if you don't mind, this might be a little bit early, but I think this may not be a bad jumping off point to give listeners a little break, go make a tea or coffee or something, and then come back and listen to the second half here of our interview with the filmmakers of One Man and His Shoes. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Yemi Bamiro, the director, and Will Thorne, producer of the recently released doc, everywhere in the world now, of One Man and His Shoes. Now, we've been talking about the film and the creation of Michael Jordan, the cultural icon. And if you were to stop at about minute 58 or so in the show, you would be, I don't think it would be unfair. I think it's extremely entertaining. It could also be something that a marketing professor, business professor, business school might show a class, bits of it. A lot of discussions about business models and how they achieved this, very cutting edge for the time, certainly marketing of certainly then putting it in the historical context of an African-American athlete. But I want to ask you, this film, maybe it's unfair to describe it this way, but to me it seems to pivot quite, not sharply, but it does make a pivot about that time. And was that intentional? Because then we are going to talk about some of what I will say is the sort of, like a better way of putting it, darker side of this phenomenon.
Yeah, it was intentional. I kind of felt that we couldn't pivot without sort of, laying the groundwork as to what this phenomenon was and is. And I think it's something that we grappled with for a long time, but we always knew that it was just part of the story. So as filmmakers, as journalists, it was sort of like our responsibility to sort of not whitewash history and sort of like not revise history, but, just tell it how it is. Like, I think the final act of the film is all fact. I think you can sort of just Google any of that stuff and, you will come across hundreds, if not thousands of stories about, young kids getting shot for Jordans. Why they get shot for Jordans is, I think that's a bigger sort of like debate that the film is not about. But, unfortunately there is a darker side to this phenomenon, and it kind of like felt like our responsibility to sort of explore it, because it's sort of, it's an unfortunate legacy of the sneaker.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, for me personally, I mean, you've it's 30 years. It's hard to believe it's been 30 years, but you've got the 1990 Rick Tellender SI cover article that's about the death of Michael Eugene Thomas. I came, like you say, you can Google all this stuff. There's some debate about numbers, but I've seen figures that somewhere around potentially 1,000 to 1,200 kids a year lose their lives or are victims of some crimes related to sneakers. I mean, I gather this was this. Well, before I get to that, I mean, why do kids kill each other for sneakers? Why is this happening?
I think these sneakers are jewels, man. They're jewels in these communities, and they sort of like symbolize status. They symbolize a sort of like an element of wealth, and like I think when you have disenfranchised people in certain communities that don't have a lot, I think that stuff is just gonna happen, you know. And I think you also look at the way these shoes are marketed. You know, I think those early ads from the 80s are sort of like, you know, it's the shoes, it's got to be the shoes. It's just like, you know, these things are just like, you know, life-changing, you know, life-changing sort of like jewels. Yeah. So I think I think that feeds into a lot of it, you know. But then I think there's wider sort of like socioeconomics, you know, stuff about poverty, stuff about, you know, disenfranchised, you know, members of certain communities. You know, you could talk about you sort of like inequality, the wealth divide, like, you know, all of these really like meaty topics. But the film was never about that, you know. And I think that those things are a film in itself. We just wanted to basically, you know, convey that this stuff happens and this is an unfortunate legacy of this sneaker. I think it would have been a bit weird to sort of like tell the story of Air Jordans and not talk about that, because because everybody knows it like happened, like, you know, everyone knows that it still happens to this day. Like, it's, you know, rappers talk about it in their songs. Like, it's just part of the ether. Do you know what I mean? That Jordans are so precious and so like people regard them with so much, you know, with rose tinted glasses, that this stuff just happens, you know?
So, I mean, you've basically said on a number of occasions, but the whole point of the film was to basically, or maybe Yemi, you can touch on this, was that there's this, obviously Air Jordans are part of hip hop culture, all kinds of different, you know, rap songs. We've now got more than 30 years worth of Air Jordan that have been come out. It was just to document this in sort of all in one place, that this is how it happened, and this is the phenomenon as it stands now. Is that essentially what the purpose of the film was, or is?
Well, yes, and I kind of feel, I think the easiest way to think about it is this. I think if you think about Air Jordans as the Ferrari of sneakers, I wanted to know, how did Air Jordan become the Ferrari of sneaker? Right. So I think that didn't just happen. You know, there were lots of sort of like moving parts that sort of like led to that happening. It was perfect timing. It was sort of like 1980s America. You know, it was what was happening then. It was sort of like Reagan's sort of like America, sort of, you know, it was like Reaganomics. It was sort of like this big boom in America where it's just kind of like everybody's out to get rich. And I think you had the emergence of like big brands like McDonald's, Chevrolet, Nike, and, you know, it's understanding the time and sort of almost like the building blocks that led to this all happening. And I was interested in that because I'd never seen anything that had done that. I'd never seen anything that had looked forensically at sort of like the economics of Air Jordans, like, but not just the economics, but sort of like the cultural currency of Air Jordans, and sort of like how this penetrated pop culture and sort of like changed the world, and why, you know, 35 years on, we are still talking about this sneaker after this guy retired like over, you know, 15 years ago. Like, why are we still having these conversations? And why hasn't anything eclipsed this sneaker? You know, and nothing's eclipsed this sneaker because he was the blueprint. You know, Nike's relationship with Michael Jordan was the blueprint to everything. That's the reason why you have Adidas and David Beckham. That's the reason why you have LeBron James and Nike. That's the reason why you have Steph Curry and Under Armour, you know, because Michael Jordan and Nike was the blueprint to everything. And it's not just in sports, it's just across the board. You know, I think it's just kind of like, let's take a pitch man to sort of like be the face of our brand. That didn't happen before Michael Jordan and Nike. So I was obsessed with I was obsessed with how that happened.
Yeah. And I'll just add, I think your passion comes through in the film.
Thanks.
I'll call it passion instead of obsession. But you in the film, you as just for clarity's sake, and I've got some journalism background, those numbers I put out, I agree. They are, I tried to look for confirmation of where these numbers come from, and I kept following link after link after link and couldn't actually find the source. So it's just a number that's been thrown out there. But I think, as Will very well put, whatever the number is, there's no, and you guys, both of you have said, there's the facts, and it happened 30 years ago, and it's still happening. So there's this issue with Air Jordans. You focus on the. Is there a reason you focused on the Joshua Woods case in particular?
I think that case sort of was the one that travelled here. I think I remember reading that story in an English newspaper. Yeah. It may have been The Guardian. It may have been, I don't know what, I think it was The Guardian. And I remember reading that thinking, that's insane. That, you know, because it wasn't just local. It wasn't just a story that happened in Houston. It wasn't just a story. It wasn't national. It wasn't a story just happened in America. It sort of like traveled. And, you know, I'm sitting in my room in Southeast London reading about, you know, this 21-year-old, like, you know, young person that sort of like got murdered for buying a pair of like Air Jordans. So I think that's why it sort of resonated with me, because, you know, I probably could have, you know, checked local news and found, you know, a number of stories, but it was the fact that, you know, journalists in a British newspaper were writing about it, and I just happened to sort of like come across it. And then I also think that, you know, Daisy Williams, I think, at the time, around the time that her son passed, she was very motivated to sort of like raise awareness about the fact that this had happened to her son, and that it was still and this wasn't a new phenomenon. This is what, you know, young people dying over Air Jordans wasn't anything new. And she was quite vocal on that. She had sort of like a Facebook page, and she sort of like had like a little charity raising awareness about sort of, you know, this sort of thing. So I was kind of interested in her activism, so to speak. And then when I spoke to her, she was kind of really surprised that, you know, someone on this side of the world had knew about the story. And yeah, it kind of, what followed was sort of like 3 or 4 years of, you know, going back and forth to Houston to sort of like talk to her, and, you know, her just allowing us in, basically.
As you point out, I mean, I think she and others are quite eloquent, and I think you play this, as they would say here, as I'm based in the UK, with a straight bat. I think, you know, but you do pose, or questions are posed about Nike and also Michael Jordan, about, you know, I know Michael, I think, sent some Air Jordan 28s to Joshua Wood's sister after the incident. I know he's, in other cases, has sent his condolences. But is this something you guys have a position on, about what you think Nike and Michael Jordan should be doing in these cases? Or did you just want to pose that out there to let us as an audience to kind of come up with our own conclusions?
I think, me personally, I think as filmmakers, you know, we'll jump in if you think differently, but we were really passionate about not telling the viewer what to think. You know, we didn't want to spoon feed anybody and say, you know, this is what we think, therefore this is what you think. Yeah. I think we were just interested in presenting the facts and sort of, you know, like, you know, giving the people in the film that, you know, these things happen to agency just to tell it how it is. You know, like Daisy said what she said, like I didn't tell her what to say, like that's how she felt. Yeah. And I think having spent time with people like Daisy, like we spent time with other sort of other parents who unfortunately lost children over this thing. I think that the overriding thing that I took away from speaking to them is that, you know, they weren't necessarily blaming sort of like Nike, but I think they wanted some acknowledgement that this has happened. I think that was the thing, you know, especially with Daisy. She just wanted acknowledgement. She just wanted them to sort of like just come out and just say that, you know, this is, you know, you don't condone this and this shouldn't be happening. But I think, you know, I think she took their perhaps silence as complicity in some respects.
Yep.
And I think that's the thing that, you know, that upset her. But I think as far as we go, as far as filmmakers, you know, it was really important that we not spoon feed anyone, and there was no agenda to this. You know, like our entry point into this film was just like, we're just fans of, you know, this time and this brand, and we just kind of like want to tell this story because we've never seen it before. But you know, as journalists, we can't ignore the fact that, you know, this is a footnote in this Shew's legacy that we have to explore, because it's our responsibility as filmmakers to explore it. It's not our responsibility to tell viewers what to think, but we think that we should present the facts and leave it, you know, up to, you know, whoever sees the film to make up their own mind.
And the whole time, and the whole time we were making the film, you know, we were very aware of what we were doing. You know, it was opening a can of worms, but you know, we didn't set out to make a film that was trying to answer the can of worms. We were trying to basically make a film about Air Jordans and, you know, the Air Jordan brand. And that comes with a side order of a can of worms, you know? Right. Like, we can't tell that story without sort of telling this side of it. And as I said before, this is not a news story. This is, you know, you can go and, you know, there's people all over the internet and they're kind of already arguing this thing. Or they're criticizing, or they're completely Jordans, or it's not the brand's fault. What can they do? All of that stuff's there, and we kind of know. Okay, well, you know, that's another film.
Right. I mean, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think.
Also, sorry. The thing I was going to say. Also, I think, you know, we knew that was what we were doing, but I think. You know, for me as well, a producer, like these guys, it's their film, you know, and then when I watched it, it's very balanced. Obviously, there's going to be marketing. There's going to be, like you said to someone in a picture, it's about Air Jordans, and then it's about people feeling further. You know, it all sounds sensationalized. It's really balanced, especially when we get to that section. I think, as you say, we straight back, we go, here you go, we've pointed a camera, you know, something that's going on in this decade right now. And then we discuss it afterwards with a bunch of those main players, you know, with those people that were there, and they get to say their little piece.
And I think all the talking heads, everyone played it the same. It was interesting. It was almost like mini straight bats, I felt like, you know, to use that analogy. I mean, because you guys were doing, it's certainly my own personal taste in terms of documentary filmmaking, which is to document and let the camera, you know, let the actors say what they say or whatever, but not try to, like you say, spoon feed, not to tell the viewers what they should think or conclusions they should draw. But then the people you were interviewing were saying similar things, I think. Whether it's Rick Tellender, who's the young African-American woman journalist who's she was
Jamil Hill.
Yeah, she was actually she was very good. You know, we know Michael Jordan's not Malcolm X, you know, I mean, kind of was one of the quotes, I think. A lot of people have said it. And I mean, you're well aware of it. I think probably some in our audience will be aware that, I mean, this has been going on. I lived in North Carolina in the late 80s and early 90s. And I even then, you know, anyone who had the smallest of causes were like, you know what, I'm going to write a letter to Michael Jordan and I'm going to get him to you know, there's been this call. This is another episode. That's a whole nother story, and maybe it comes up in the last dance. But you know, what Michael Jordan does or doesn't do in terms of commenting on social issues. It's what he's done. He never has usually commented on things, and there have been a lot of people who've wanted him to, rightly or wrongly. I'm not sure, but I mean, in terms of So this is a big year for docs about Michael Jordan, and I include yours as part of that. I mean, in terms of this project, I mean, you kind of alluded to it. I think you've tried, or I think, what is it, Roland Lazenby, you were filming, what, 2014 or something. So how long has this taken to get this project to this point?
Okay, so I started thinking about this project in 2012. I remember really vividly. So it was November 2012, and I started thinking about, you know, I'd always wanted to make something long form, and I started thinking about, you know, topics, broad stroke topics that I was interested in. And then, you know, initially this film was going to be about the phenomenon of sneakers. You know, it was going to be sort of like about sneaker collectors and about Air Jordan collectors. But then I realized that that wasn't very interesting, and I was having these sort of like internal conversations with myself, like late 2012, early 2013. And then I sort of said, well, okay, I'm going to spend, I kind of like gave myself a 3-year plan. I said that in 2013 I was going to like somehow make some sort of like teaser to sort of like, you know, communicate this idea. 2014, I was going to sort of like spend the year like trying to raise some money to make it. And 2015, we were going to make it. So I gave myself that 3-year plan at the end of 2012. And obviously it didn't work out like that, because we're in August 2020 and we're sitting here and the film's only just come out. But yeah, I mean, it was, you know, like Will attest to this. Like, this is a truly independent endeavor. Like, you know, I think we started making this film when I kind of like still documentary of this type weren't, you know, documentary wasn't rich like it was now. Do you know what I mean? And I kind of feel that people didn't really get it, because we're British filmmakers and we're in the UK, and like, you want to tell this story that's essentially sort of like, you know, all set in America with American contributors about Michael Jordan. Why are you making a story about Michael Jordan's sneakers? Just make a story about Michael Jordan. Like, we heard everything. But I think that, you know, we always just believed in the story, and, you know, we funded it ourselves. And the fact that you know, all of our sort of like contributors, all the actuality takes place in the States. You know, it was a long sort of like, you know, it was a long undertaking, because, you know, it was, we were sort of like funding this ourselves. So I would say, you know, about 7 years. It's sort of like, you know, we have been sort of like chipping away at this thing and sort of, you know, trying to get it made. And then, you know, The Last Dance sort of like comes along, and then everybody's like, oh, like, Michael Jordan, this is like really cool. Like, he's phenomenal. Like, there's 10 episodes on Netflix about Michael Jordan. And then we just happen to have a finished documentary on, you know, the phenomenon of Air Jordan sneakers. Like, it was almost like we planned it, but we didn't.
So people should be beating a path to your door to get this doc shown, shouldn't they? I mean, it's. Everyone's laughing. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I leave it to Will, but I think in terms of like territories that are going to see it, you know, I think we haven't done badly in terms of who is going to get to see it.
Yeah, I think just to pick up, like, so, you know, obviously Yemi's been on this journey for 7 years. I think I'd probably checked in a year or so later. But yeah, what you got to remember is you put basically all of your money, all your time and spare time and effort, and you somehow drag a documentary feature film into existence over 6 years, 7 years. And then you get into South by Southwest Festival.
And then
you export your film on the hard drive a week before you're going to fly. You tell South by Southwest, yeah, it's finished, it's coming, and you're editing. And then the week before, you go, okay, we're running out of time. Stick it on the hard drive.
Yeah.
Go to Texas, and then they call you and say, "There's a pandemic." That's pretty much how it went down.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think actually because of COVID, they bumped The Last Dance up. They actually brought it forward because it was slated for later in the year, and then all these people locked down, and they basically demanded, bring us The Last Dance. So just when we were basically curled up in a ball, crying, thinking, oh, our big festival premiere, finally, our moment in the sun, it was all over. We sort of, this came back on the scene, and then, obviously then that made like Vice in the US sort of come and take a look at us and go, okay, perhaps we can put this out towards the end of The Last Dance. So we're kind of able to, that's how we kind of got the US. And now we're actually going to be out, we're releasing across all digital on the 25th of August in the US. As Yemi said, the Australians picked it up. I think it goes out on their players this Friday, the 6th. We're actually, believe it or not, going to be in some cinemas in Holland, in Amsterdam.
Oh, wow.
I think that's the 27th of August.
Yeah.
So and we got a great sales team, Canoe Film. Caroline, she's been out there. The film's been on her radar for a long time. She's known us for the film, and she's sort of, since the start of the year, she's been banging the drum. So we're having very sort of meaningful talks with all the people you'd kind of want to, all the territories. So I think it's gonna. The great thing, we were chatting about this the other day, is that we pitched this film around. We got custard pied. People said no, it's a niche subject, and no one's going to want to watch this. And it's like the Middle East just bought it.
Exactly.
I think that.
So I think it's going to get out there. I don't think it's as niche as everyone thought.
I mean, it's hard to. I mean, having seen it, it's hard to think of it as niche. But it's an interesting journey you guys have had, because this, your journey started pre-golden age of documentary. It's because I was even going to ask you, because you've done this purely independently. Whereas I think a lot of people now would be thinking, oh, I'm going to try to, like you say, get a sizzle, get a teaser or something, and go around to Netflix or whoever to pitch this idea. That might be the way you might have done things differently. I don't know, but this is like kind of old school. By way things are going now, old school way of doing a documentary.
Well, just to jump in, I mean, when you said about the Joshua Woods case, one of the reasons, obviously, it did come internationally. I remember getting a phone call off of Yemi saying, well, I've just seen the story, and I've just dropped Daisy Williams an email. She's come back and she said it hasn't even gone to trial. And I was like, you got to get on the plane, Yemi. Get on the plane, let's go start filming. And actually, we cobbled together, a little bit of money, and got him on a plane. Here's a camera, off you go. And during that trip, he actually interviewed. I think you interviewed Roland. You interviewed Ted Lander even that time. I think he interviewed 4 or 5 people, and then did like a trip to Daisy. Those interviews are in the film.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that was kind of, Yemi had done a taster by himself, and then when I got involved, we were kind of like, let's expand it, let's start shooting it, but let's at least start shooting it and make a more rounded taster maybe. But he went off and did that stuff and got these interviews that lasted the test of time, and really got the goods that time round, even though it was maybe like we were thinking at that point, well, worst case scenario, we're going to have a really shit hot teaser here, and we'll start banked. Actually, we shot the film. We got a lot of important interviews early on, which was great.
You alluded to it just a few moments ago. I mean, people are like scratching their head. These 2 British guys going around trying to document one of the most quintessential American stories you can think of. And I will say, I thought even that beginning intro bit where you've got the speeches of Reagan and Bush Senior going, and and you just kept, you kind of timelines it and the graphics and everything. I mean, well, do you think there's been an advantage to having to being well, not necessarily British, but being not non-American or an outsider, and how is it that you are the ones that have come to document this and not someone else, not someone maybe US based?
Well, this is the thing. I've thought about this a lot, and I think it just always goes back to sort of the entry point being just like fandom. Like we remember sort of like that era. We remember, Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. We remember the fact that Michael Jordan was the most marketing man in sports history with all of his endorsements, not just Nike, McDonald's, Chevrolet, Gatorade, just everything. And I remember sort of like being in school and just just knowing that there was this guy that was just basically the god of basketball. And whenever I thought about the story, I just thought, like, why hasn't anyone told a story about how Air Jordans became this phenomenon? Like, why hasn't anyone told that story? And I was always, every year I would sort of like have this like anxiety that someone would like tell it, but like no one would really tell it in the way that we had planned on telling it, like which would be this blow by blow account that wasn't oversaturated with the sneakerhead thing, because obviously that's a huge thing, but I wanted sort of what was going on in society, because all of these things were building blocks that fed in to how the phenomenon came to be. You can't really talk about the Bulls and sort of like Jordan and sort of like Nike without talking about the context of the time. And then just because I've always been obsessed with America since I was sort of like me and my sister grew up on a healthy dose of sort of like American sort of like TV when we were kids. So I kind of like had this understanding of, and fandom of sort of like US culture. And I think all of those things just like fed into, the making of this film. So I don't know why someone else didn't tell this story, but in terms of like our lens, in terms of my lens in telling this story, it's always come from a place of fandom. It's always come from a place of intrigue. It's always come from a place of fascination. It's always come from a place of sort of like appreciation, of this thing. And yeah, I just kind of thought, well, if we can get, the key architects, like, I want to talk to Jim Riswold. I think it's important that we talk to Sonny. It's important that we sort of like, talk to these people that were in the room that can give us an understanding, how this happened, because they were responsible for creating this phenomenon that has sort of lasted, this long. And I think that was always the obsession, just to sort of like get these men and women to sort of like tell this story, because I always found this story fascinating, and I thought that other people would as well.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is something in the fact that we're outsiders. Yeah, I think there might be something that I don't know. But I think as Yemi said, or as I was saying earlier, Spike Lee and the kind of do the right thing, and I think we sort of grew up as fans of the brand. And I think that's again that's maybe the kind of USP that we've got, is that we sort of looking maybe in at this brand or as something that was maybe imported to us, and so it's this thing. It's just like kryptonite that comes in a shoebox, and it's like so maybe that's and excuse me, and that essence of it is what kind of combines anyone who loves Air Jordan or has that excitement or any, that phenomenon, that was affected by it, or, we can, that's that whole kind of thing, which is why it was always so stupid when people say it's niche, is because there's someone in Japan who's putting on Air Jordans that I just connect with immediately. And that was always the thing, I suppose. And, if this thing's kind of going around and it just is a thing, we sort of looked in on it. I don't know. Perhaps if you were from the US, it's just more of an intrinsic part of you, like it's too obvious. I don't know. But that was really the entry point. And then, you know, Yemi's done a very good job of, like you say, like earlier with the Reagan, it becomes very layered. It becomes
Yeah.
lots of different stories and, you know, eras, and this all kind of like actually does feed into this one sort of, you know, brand.
And I mean, just so because it's hard to believe that we're kind of coming towards the end of our time together, but you do say in the film I think you did reach out to Nike and Brand Jordan, just to make that clear for the audience that you did. Did you get any reaction from them? I know they're not on camera.
No, I think we just kind of like maybe our emails, like, you know, fell on sort of like deaf ears, but I think it goes back to sort of like what I said before. You know, not everyone you ask is always going to sort of like be in your documentary for whatever reason. And I think, you know, I was really interested in speaking to, you know, because there are a few of the architects that were involved in all of this that still work at Nike, you know, and that's why I wanted to talk to them. But for whatever reason, we never heard back from them, and that's completely fine. I think the men and women that we do have in the film, you know, were gracious enough to sort of like give us their time and sort of like tell us their stories, and you know, I think it holds up.
Go ahead, Will. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and of course, like we had to, you know, reach out as journalists.
Yes.
You know, like I said, the film is balanced, so of course, and you know, if Michael Jordan wanted to do an interview, great, you know. So yeah, like obviously we went down that route, but we weren't expecting a lot. We weren't so surprised.
No, and I think, but I just want to stress to the audience that you have an amazing cast of characters, I think, in the film, in terms of people who talk to camera and about their experiences, whether they were observers of American culture. Love the marketing professor that you have, but even the actual actors. I mean, you have pretty much everyone who was involved except for maybe Bob Knight, the owner of Nike. I mean, actually they're going to, you know, on camera saying this is how it happened. This is how we created this thing. So I think well done.
You know, like with a lot of docs, you know, we did a lot of interviews. You know, we did do a lot of interviews. We had to reshoot some. You know, there was like docs are so kind of, you're in the hands of the god, right? You can turn up and, you know, what you get is what you get. You know, these are real people. If like they've had a bad morning, you might not get a great interview. And, you know, we had to do a lot to really, you know, get the gold that you see on screen. But we were very blessed, I think, that a lot of those main players, you know, they're all characters. They're all people that have, you know, been successful. You don't kind of be an exec at Nike without being able to kind of talk and hold your own. And I think, you know, a lot of these people, it just shows you as well with docs. It's interesting, you know, if someone's engaging on screen, it can go a long way, you know. I mean, our film's quite tight with the storytelling, so that's great. But yeah, we were lucky to get some of these people sort of on a good day, you know. They were willing to kind of tell us some of the stories.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question I'm going to ask you, which you probably have thought of, but given all that's been going on and what your focus has been, maybe you haven't given much thought to this, but what's next for both of you in terms of now that you're finally getting this released, besides a well-deserved break or rest or whatever, but what do you have next in line?
I'm not sure. I kind of feel that, you know, and Will might be able to chime in on this. I think one of the reasons, you know, why we wanted to make this film, in addition to the fact that we were obsessed with the story, is that, you know, essentially we're first-time filmmakers, and you know, no one was ever going to give us X amount of money to sort of like go and make our first film. So we sort of like made it ourselves. But we kind of want this film to sort of like be a calling card. It was always kind of, you know, we want to sort of like show people that we can coherently and sort of like creatively tell a story, and it can stand up, you know, and we can do it independently. So I think, you know, if we get an opportunity to make a second feature, that'd be incredible. And I think, you know, that kind of like was the objective of making our first film, to sort of just kind of like say, you know, hello, we're here, we can, you know, we've got stories, we've got ideas, and we kind of want to do this. Because I think, you know, I think there's, you know, it's an interesting time in the world at the moment. You know, there is a sort of like, there is a global reckoning, and there's sort of, you know, like sectors and industries are sort of like grappling with themselves in relation to sort of like who does what and who gets an opportunity to do what. And hopefully our film, you know, shows that, you know, with a bit of hard graft, with a bit of perseverance, that you can sort of, you know, you can sort of achieve, you know, what we've achieved. And hopefully it won't be as hard to sort of like get the second one off the ground, because, you know, we've truly paid our dues making this over the last 7 years. So yeah, I think making a second film is a dream, and hopefully we've done enough with this film to sort of not entice people, just to prove to people that, you know, we can tell a story and we are competent filmmakers.
Yeah, I think it's going to be quite exciting, the kind of, you know, getting up for battle the second time and seeing, you know, how much ammo we've got this time compared to last time, which was no ammo. And, you know, we've talked around a few ideas, and, you know, I've got a company, Breaking Films. This I'm really proud. This is the first film to be released. So, you know, I'm pretty chuffed. The first one out of the stable is doing well. So I'm you know, and I was very happy with the film. I got another film later in the year, but, you know, docs are just a different beast. And you know, like I say, although we've kind of chucked around some ideas and maybe working on some treatments, and, you know, I think there's a kind of, and the reason I mentioned Breaking Films is, you know, like my whole kind of remit is just to sort of make entertaining and just engaging films, really. That's kind of, you know, I'm interested in good characters, I'm interested in good stories. Like, it's not rocket science, you know. And then, you know, you want something that's looks good and sounds good, and, you know, kind of has an air of you know, like Yemi's put his stamp on it, and it kind of, you know, you watch it and you go, okay, yeah, this is a filmmaker's film, you know, there's an identity in the style. So yeah, it'll be very, I mean, and just as a quick note, I mean, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but you know, we were racing to get the film done for South by Southwest. I know this is going out in September, it's now August. I mean, we've only just cut a trailer a few weeks ago. We're kind of still in the fire a little bit. We're just kind of brushing off the flames as we come back down. So right now, I mean, we're talking about, are we going to go to Amsterdam during this lockdown pandemic?
Maybe.
It's a bit wild. It's a bit of a crazy thing to do, but yeah, I think we're just looking to kind of enjoy the release now. Like I say, it's going to release in the US, you know, properly. It's going to start going to these territories. Yeah, I think in the short term, it's just going to be good to see the film get out there and start seeing reaction, you know. Once the audience start watching it, you know, they start writing their own version of the movie. It becomes its own thing, you know. But, you know, we've done our best. We've made, like, our film, and, you know, I'm just looking forward to it getting out there and seeing kind of how it does. And I think after that, you know, it'd be interesting to go, okay, well, it did this. Let's talk about maybe going off and making this, because, you know, or people will hopefully come to us going, hey, we kind of like what you did. We do some thing. Let's talk. You know, that's the kind of, basically Netflix, if you're listening.
Well, I think we many of us all know that feeling. I mean, I think I should just state once again. I mean, for our listeners, this is September, so you all should have access to this film, and I highly recommend it. I think it's I've watched it twice now. It was really enjoyed it, and I think it tells. I mean, what strikes me, because I now, one of my gigs is doing this podcast, and what has struck me in the last few weeks, especially all that's going on, especially in the U.S. but worldwide, and this year of this bizarre year that is 2020, is that there's a wealth of stories still to be told. You know, we all thought everything had been said before, but no, that's not true. In fact, there's so many stories to be told. and from unique voices that haven't been heard before. And I think that's this sort of democratization of filmmaking that is hopefully happening. I know there's other issues and pressures, and we're not going to talk about distribution and that some of the challenges there, but that's what struck me, and why I think it's such a compelling medium right now. That we thought we knew about what happened in the 80s and the 90s, and actually, in retrospect, and you guys have shined a great light on it. It made me rethink about a period of time that I lived through. I now saw a little differently than I had previously, and that goes with so many of the films that we're have had on the podcast in season 1, and now are hoping to have in season 2. So just want to thank you guys for coming on to Factual America season 2, first episode. And just to say, I guess if people want to follow you, we'll put links in the show notes. But what's the best way of keeping a wrap on you guys?
I have an Instagram. It's just Yemi Bamiro, at Yemi Bamiro, and the same for Twitter as well. And yeah, all of my work's on my website, yemibamiro.com.
So is that the site I've seen where you've got all these? You went to the Bernabeu. Someone's got some shots of.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah.
Real Madrid. Was that?
Yeah.
Is that for another project?
No, that was a job that I did last year for. I did like a commercial. It was like a short branded film for Adidas and Real Madrid. So,
wow.
It was an insane job, to be fair. Like, we went to sort of like El Clasico, like we were like pitch side, saw Messi in the flesh. Like, it was unreal. But yeah, that was a really bizarre sort of like surreal job, because those guys are proper superstars, and we got to hang out with them for like on and off like 2 weeks, and sort of like make this film about their new kit launch. And then it's kind of like pretty cool, because now they just won the league. They've won the Liga now. So it sort of came full circle. But yeah, that was a cool gig.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, but everything's on my website.
Okay, excellent. And Will, how can we keep track of what?
Yeah, you can. I think I was just searching it. I'm such a granddad. I was like,
don't worry. We'll put the links. You send us the links later, and they'll be in the show notes.
Well, actually, the funny thing is, I think it's just Breakham Films. I think it's my company name, so I should have known anyway. Breakham Films, the website, but also mainly Instagram. I have got a Twitter. I probably should start using that a bit more. Actually, as we'll be doing a release, I think I'm going to have to dive into all this stuff. But yeah, Instagram is probably the better one.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you once again,
thank you so
guys.
Much for having us.
It's been a pleasure having you on. Remind everyone the film is One Man and His Shoes, and we'll have links and things in the show notes in terms of how you can find this film. So thank you yet again, Yemi Bamiro, director, and Will Thorne, the producer of One Man and His Shoes. I want to send a shout out to This Is Distorted Studios here in Leeds, England. And please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.